From a blood spatter analyst who lived by a code, to a prosthetic surgeon who staged every kill like a message written in flesh, this is Dexter versus the Ice Truck Killer. Brothers by blood, but killers on completely different levels. If Brian had actually unleashed his full potential, would Dexter have made it out alive? Let's break it down, starting with the fact no one can ignore, Brian was a better long-term planner. The Ice Truck Killer was light years ahead of Dexter. Brian Moser's ability to plan and execute his vision over years demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that put his younger brother to shame. Brian didn't just kill, he created an elaborate multi-year masterpiece designed specifically to awaken Dexter's memories. While Dexter hunted compulsively week after week, Brian patiently built the ultimate reunion, mapping out every step with ruthless precision. Think about it. Brian infiltrated Dexter's inner circle by seducing Deborah, established a respected professional identity as Rudy Cooper, purchased their childhood home, and staged murders that recreated pieces of their shared history. All this without ever alerting Dexter or the police to his true intentions until he was ready for the reveal.
I waited a long time to meet you.
His bloodless crime scenes had forensic genius Dexter completely baffled. The colored fingernails, the ice truck, the doll parts in Dexter's fridge. Every element was a calculated message leading Dexter back to the shipping container where it all began. Even killing their father, Joel Driscoll, was part of Brian's intricate puzzle designed to force Dexter to confront their shared origins. Now, that's the level of control that puts Dexter's nightmare adventures to shame. Brian's killings were art, communication, and psychological manipulation all wrapped into one bloody package. I personally think that if Brian had focused this level of planning on something other than reconnecting with Dexter, he might have never been caught. Brian outplanned Dexter at every turn, and the deeper you look, the worse it gets for our so-called hero. If you're into these kind of breakdowns, make sure to hit subscribe because we've got more coming. But planning's one thing, execution is another. And Brian's skills went way beyond strategy. He had more advanced medical knowledge. The Ice Truck Killer's medical expertise gave him a deadly edge that even Dexter couldn't match. Brian's training as a prosthetist in Paris equipped him with an intimate understanding of the human form that elevated his killings from brutal to artistic. Brian's anatomical knowledge allowed him to completely drain his victims of blood before dismembering them, a technique that left Miami Metro's best forensic minds, including his brother, shocked and confused. While Dexter struggled with messy kills that required extensive cleanup, Brian's crime scenes were clinically pristine. His medical background looked like it was just a cover at first, but it wasn't. He really polished that skill to use it exactly how he wanted. Brian could manipulate the human body however he wanted, removing limbs exactly at joint lines and cutting through tissues with expert accuracy. He even kept Tony Tucci alive while systematically removing his limbs, demonstrating a level of control over life and death that Dexter never achieved.
And the ritual is intoxicating.
The way Brian handled his victims' remains showed his superior technical skill. Each body part was perfectly preserved, wrapped, and displayed with medical attention to detail. No wonder he could maintain his cover as a respected medical professional. He actually was one. Remember how he fitted Tony with prosthetics after cutting off his hand and leg? Takes some serious skill. In contrast, Dexter had dropped out of medical school, relying instead on more primitive cutting techniques. His approach was effective, but lacked the clinical sophistication of his brother's work. Dexter's kills were about satisfying his urge and disposing of evidence, while Brian turned the human body into a canvas for his twisted artistry. Brian's medical training gave him the crucial advantage in the serial killer game, the ability to approach murder with scientific detachment while creating visually striking displays that communicated directly to his brother. I mean, what other killer could have done that? With that though, he had another deadly edge over Dexter. His surgical skill was scary, but the number of people he used it on is even worse, because his kill count was actually higher. The Ice Truck Killer had built a blood-soaked resume that dwarfed Dexter's at the time of their meeting. Brian Moser had eliminated over 20 victims by the start of season 1, while Dexter was still relatively early in his murderous career. Brian's kill history stretched back much further than most realize. His first confirmed murder dated back to the early 1990s, when he operated under the moniker NHI Killer with 5 known victims. Each of these early kills showcase a different method as Brian perfected his craft, strangling Felix Woodard, shooting Paul Martinez point blank, and several others that demonstrated his experimentation with various killing techniques.
Guess you haven't heard of an electric chainsaw.
The scale of Brian's operations was staggering. By the time Dexter noticed the bloodless body parts appearing around Miami, Brian had already dismembered and displayed numerous prostitutes. His extensive experience meant that he encountered and overcome countless potential complications that could have exposed a less seasoned killer. Brian's ability to evade capture for years demonstrated his superior experience in managing crime scenes and covering his tracks. While Dexter benefited from insider knowledge as a forensic analyst, Brian stayed ahead of the authorities purely through skill and caution. He killed in multiple jurisdictions, modified his methods, and never left enough evidence to create a viable suspect profile. Brian's extensive practice gave him the confidence and control that Dexter simply hadn't developed yet. Brian was the seasoned veteran, while Dexter, despite his code and training, was still relatively green by comparison. But Brian's advantage went beyond mere numbers. He was much better at psychological manipulation. The Ice Truck Killer played mind games that left both his brother and the entire Miami Metro Department dancing to his tune. Brian Moser's ability to psychologically manipulate everyone around him revealed a level of emotional intelligence that Dexter, for all his charm, couldn't match.
Stay where you are. I'm armed.
Brian created psychological triggers specifically designed to unlock Dexter's repressed memories. The doll parts in the refrigerator, the bloodless corpses arranged in familiar locations, the hotel room drenched in blood. Each was a calculated psychological catalyst aimed at his brother's subconscious. While Dexter struggled to understand basic human emotions, Brian expertly weaponized them. His manipulation extended well beyond Dexter. Brian seduced Dexter Morgan so completely that she fell in love with him, never suspecting his true nature until it was too late. He played the role of caring boyfriend perfectly, making her feel special and understood while using her to access information about the investigation targeting him. When he finally revealed himself, the psychological damage was devastating to say the least. The police department fared no better against Brian's mind games either. He left false evidence that sent them pursuing phantom leads, planted a witness testimony that never existed, and even framed an innocent man to throw them off his trail. Every move was designed to create confusion while maintaining complete control of the narrative. What made Brian truly exceptional was his ability to maintain multiple personas simultaneously. As Rudy Cooper, he was the charming, empathetic doctor helping amputees. As a boyfriend, he was the attentive and passionate. As the Ice Truck Killer, he was the methodical and ruthless. He could switch between these identities seamlessly, something that Dexter, with his rehearsed social interactions, could never achieve. Brian's psychological manipulation skills made him far more dangerous than Dexter ever was. He killed, sure, and that's scary on its own, but he also broke minds. The fact that he could get so close to the investigation without anyone catching on shows just how completely he controlled everyone around him. And that psychological edge bled straight into the crime scenes, because his crime scenes were simply way more complex. The Ice Truck Killer turned murder into high art while Dexter was still finger painting. Brian Moser's crime scenes transcended mere killings to become elaborate installations that communicated on multiple levels, displaying a sophistication that made Dexter's plastic wrap kill rooms look primitive by comparison. Brian's crime scenes were unimaginable. The bodies discovered in the Miami swimming pool and fountain were carefully arranged in lifelike poses, as if the victims were still enjoying their surroundings despite being in pieces. This dark theater required extraordinary patience and precision that Dexter's straightforward approach never attempted.
I'm a very neat monster.
The technical execution of Brian showed how far Brian's mind really went. While Dexter struggled to keep his kill rooms from leaking evidence, Brian's scenes were clinical in their perfection. No DNA, no fingerprints, no blood splatter for his brother to analyze. Each location Brian chose carried symbolic weight tied to Dexter's past. The hotel room, bathed in collected blood, required Brian to store and transport gallons of blood without detection, but he did it easily. The logistical complexity alone demonstrated skills far beyond Dexter's basic preparation. Even Brian's message delivery showed superior creativity. The fingertips frozen in a block of ice, and the doll parts left in Dexter's own refrigerator, these were personal communications embedded within public crime scenes, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Dexter's straightforward, knife-to-the-heart approach paled in comparison. Brian's elaborate crime scenes reveal a level of artistic vision and technical execution that Dexter never developed. While Dexter focused on efficient disposal, Brian got to his brother and the public. The way he he balanced the dramatic impact with forensic invisibility showed a master at work. But what really set Brian apart was how he operated completely independently, unlike his codependent brother. Yet, he was never in the shadows. All while living a double life in plain sight, he just perfectly blended into the crowd. The Ice Truck Killer moved through society like a ghost, while Dexter stumbled through social interactions like a robot trying to learn how to be human. Brian Moser effortlessly maintained his cover as the charming prosthetist Rudy Cooper, existing in Miami's social life with a natural ease that his socially awkward brother never achieved. Brian's relationship with Deborah showed his remarkable ability to forge genuine seeming emotional connections. Meanwhile, Dexter struggled through basic conversations with Rita, relying on scripts and rehearsed responses just to appear normal during dinner dates. Professional environments posed no challenge for Brian either. He maintained a respected medical practice with actual patients who trusted and valued him. His colleagues saw him as dedicated and skilled, never detecting anything sinister beneath the surface. Dexter, despite years of practice, still got the suspicious glance from dokes and awkward moments with coworkers who sensed something off about him. Brian's social versatility extended to all situations, whether charming Dexter's friends, comforting patients, or navigating police interactions while dating a cop. He added flawlessly to each social setting. He could perform extroverted charisma or quiet empathy depending on which each situation required. Dexter, on the other hand, maintained roughly the same flat persona everywhere, adjusting only the intensity of his fake smile.
Maybe Rudy was right. You never can truly know anyone.
His social deception was insane. He simultaneously dated a police officer, treated the victims he mutilated, conversed with detectives investigating his crimes, and insinuated himself into his brother's life. Each role was played convincingly without bleeding into others. Dexter could barely manage keeping his dark passenger hidden from one girlfriend. Brian's social adaptability made him exponentially more dangerous than Dexter. While Dexter relied on isolation to hide his true self, Brian thrived in social environments, using them as camouflage and hunting grounds. His genuine understanding of human connection, despite lacking it himself, demonstrated an emotional intelligence that Dexter never developed, and Brian's confidence in his own abilities gave him yet another advantage over his more cautious brother, because he could switch it up whenever he wanted. The Ice Truck Killer was a deadly chameleon who constantly evolved while Dexter remained stuck in his ritualistic patterns. Brian Moser demonstrated exceptional tactical flexibility, shifting his methods based on circumstances and objectives rather than following a rigid formula like his brother. Brian's approach to murder showed remarkable versatility. When operating as the Ice Truck Killer, he drained blood and dismembered victims. When he needed to eliminate Joel Driscoll without arousing suspicion, he perfectly mimicked a natural heart attack using insulin. When confronting Angel Batista, he switched to a quick knife attack. Each situation called for different tactics, and Brian adapted flawlessly every time. His ability to improvise under pressure was unmatched. When Brian realized Tony Tucci could identify him, he quickly changed plans. Instead of just killing him, he turned Tucci into a prolonged art piece designed to haunt both Dexter and the police. When the authorities discovered his refrigerated truck, Brian immediately abandoned that method without missing a beat in his killing spree, almost like he always had a backup plan.
Deck the halls with parts of bodies.
Even Brian's victim selection demonstrated tactical flexibility. He moved between targeting anonymous prostitutes, framing innocents, and executing personal threats like their father. Each required different planning, execution, and cleanup protocols. Meanwhile, Dexter stubbornly adhered to the same basic approach for nearly every kill, making him somewhat predictable. This adaptability extended to Brian's psychological tactics as well. He adjusted his manipulation strategy for each person, for example using romance with Deborah, cryptic clues with Dexter, and misdirection with the police. When one approach failed to produce desired results, he simply recalibrated and tried another angle, unlike Dexter's often one-dimensional interactions. I personally think that Brian's willingness to abandon plans that weren't working and pivot to new approaches made him a far more effective killer than Dexter. His tactical flexibility enabled him to operate successfully across different jurisdictions and contexts without being caught. If Dexter hadn't been personally involved, Brian might have continued indefinitely. But surprisingly, while Brian's killer instincts surpassed Dexter's, his emotional depth did too. Physically, however, they were pretty evenly matched. The Ice Truck Killer proved to be Dexter's equal in terms of raw physical combat, something few of his victims could claim. Brian Moser demonstrated impressive strength, speed, and fighting ability during their climatic confrontation, showing that he was just as dangerous in hand-to-hand combat as he was with a blade. Their final confrontation revealed Brian's formidable physical capabilities. When Dexter attempted to subdue his brother, Brian countered with surprising force, breaking free from what would have incapacitated most of Dexter's victims. He immediately reversed positions, getting the upper hand in a struggle throw that caught Dexter completely off guard. Brian's attack technique showed practice efficiency. His movements were quick and deliberate, targeting vulnerable areas with precision. Unlike Dexter's other opponents, who flailed desperately, Brian fought with calculated strikes and defensive maneuvers that showed combat experience. The most telling moment came when Brian gained a dominant position and could have delivered a finishing blow, but hesitated. His emotional connection to Dexter caused him to pull back at the critical moment, suggesting that without this sentimental weakness, he might well have overpowered his younger brother. Dexter himself seemed surprised by Brian's physical abilities. Brian's overall physicality throughout the season demonstrated his strength. He subdued multiple victims without assistance, moved bodies effortlessly, and maintained enough stamina to complete his elaborate crime scenes without exhaustion. His build was similar to Dexter's, tall and solidly muscled, giving neither a clear advantage in their confrontation. I think if Brian had approached their fight with the same cold detachment he showed his other victims, the outcome might have been drastically different. His hesitation stemmed from general fraternal feeling, a vulnerability that Dexter ultimately exploited. The fact that Brian held his own against someone with Dexter's training and experience speaks volumes about his physical capabilities. What truly separated them was one core difference. Brian had no code holding him back. The Ice Truck Killer operated without constraints, while Dexter remained chained to Harry's rigid code. Brian Moser's complete freedom from moral restrictions gave him tactical advantages, decisiveness, and lethal efficiency that the rule-bound brother could never match. Brian's targeted selection showed unbridled autonomy. He chose victims based purely on his own desires and purposes, rather than filtering through Harry's criteria of confirmed guilt. This freedom allowed him to eliminate anyone who became problematic, from Joel Driscoll to Monique, without the time-consuming vetting process that Dexter required for each potential target. Decision-making speed became a crucial advantage in Brian's arsenal. When Angel Batista stumbled too close to his identity, Brian stabbed him immediately, without deliberation or moral conflict. Dexter, constantly weighing his actions against the code, often hesitated at critical moments, creating dangerous vulnerabilities that Brian simply didn't have.
I had never forgotten the day that we were born. Exactly.
The psychological burden of the code also put Dexter at a disadvantage. He carried the weight of Harry's expectations and the constant need to justify his actions. Brian operated with clarity of purpose, unburdened by manufactured guilt or external judgment. This mental freedom allowed him to focus entirely on execution rather than rationalization. Even Brian's killing methodology reflected his liberation from restrictions. His elaborately staged crime scenes and public displays would have violated Harry's primary rule of not getting caught, yet they served Brian's purposes perfectly. While Dexter constantly worried about exposure, Brian boldly claimed public spaces for his art, confident in his ability to remain undetected despite the risks. I think Brian's complete embrace of his true nature made him both more dangerous and more authentic than Dexter ever was. Without Harry's code filtering his every impulse, Brian achieved a purity of purpose that Dexter, with his competing obligations to appear normal, follow rules, and satisfy his dark passenger, could simply never reach. The brothers may have shared the same dark urges, but Brian had fed his to a much higher level than Dexter ever could. But his advantages weren't all personal like that. There was also the fact that Brian was able to track Dexter without being caught. The Ice Truck Killer shadowed Dexter like a ghost, observing his most private moments without ever being detected. Brian Moser's ability to track his brother's movements, monitor his kill ritual, and gather intimate knowledge about his life demonstrated extraordinary stealth and patience that even Dexter, a careful predator himself, never suspected.
Barbie, be patient. One day we'll share a cold one.
Brian's surveillance operation was comprehensive and detailed. He followed Dexter through his daily routines, learning his schedule, habits, and preferences without once revealing his presence. He knew Dexter's apartment layout intimately enough to repeatedly break in undetected, even moving items in Dexter's freezer without leaving evidence of the intrusion. The depth of Brian's intelligence gathering was staggering. He knew not just where Dexter worked, but the details of his relationship with colleagues. He understood Dexter's connection to his sister Deborah and his awkward romance with Rita. Most impressively, he had observed Dexter's carefully hidden kill ritual, something no one else had ever witnessed and survived. His ability to maintain this surveillance while simultaneously carrying out his own elaborate murder spree demonstrated remarkable time management and operational security. Brian balanced his professional practice, relationship with Deborah, murder tableaus, and shadowing Dexter without ever allowing these worlds to collide until he chose that moment of revelation. Ironically, Brian accomplished this surveillance against someone highly trained to detect being watched. Dexter, with his heightened paranoia and constant vigilance, never sensed Brian's presence. Even when items in his apartment were moved, Dexter never managed to catch Brian in the act or identify him through security measures. Brian was watching Dexter the whole time without leaving a single trace. If that detail detail blew your mind like it did mine? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next matchup we got coming. I personally think that Brian's ability to remain invisible while gathering such intimate knowledge about Dexter shows a level of stealth that surpasses anything Dexter demonstrated throughout the series. The fact that he could observe Dexter's most guarded secrets without detection speaks to phenomenal patience and skills that would have made him nearly impossible to catch had he not deliberately revealed himself. But perhaps most impressive was Brian's ability to perfectly calibrate his revelation for maximum psychological impact, because he never let his emotions get in the way. The Astra Killer operated like a machine, while Dexter was increasingly compromised by unwelcome emotions. Brian Moser's complete emotional detachment enabled him to make ruthlessly practical decisions unhindered by the confusion of sentiment that had begun to cloud his brother's judgment. Brian's interaction with victims displayed zero empathy, while Dexter often found himself connecting with victims on his table. Brian treated human life as purely utilitarian material for his purposes. Relationships were strategic tools for Brian, rather than emotional entanglements, designed solely to get closer to Dexter. When Deborah's usefulness ended, he discarded her without hesitation, attempting to kill her despite her obvious love for him. Dexter, meanwhile, found himself increasingly unable to separate his pretend relationships from genuine attachment. Even family connections couldn't override Brian's tactical thinking. Though he sought reunion with his brother, he was fully prepared to kill Deborah, someone that Dexter had grown to genuinely care about, simply because she didn't fit his vision of their future together.
You hurt her, and you'll hurt me.
When the moment demanded it, Brian could compartmentalize his affection for Dexter to focus on the immediate objective. The contrast between the brothers became most apparent when Dexter chose his sister over his biological brother. Brian's face registered momentary hurt, but he immediately readjusted, attempting to continue with his plan. Dexter's growing emotional attachments to his fake life had become real enough to override his biological connection with Brian. I believe that Brian's emotional detachment made him a far more effective killer than Dexter could ever be. While Dexter was increasingly entangled in a web of real relationships that complicated his dark activities, Brian remained purely focused on his objectives without internal conflict. This clarity of purpose made him more dangerous and more consistent in his actions. But once again, continuing to impress, Brian maintained this emotional control while still forming a genuine connection with his brother. That control didn't stop at emotions, because Brian outplayed the cops too. He was just always one step ahead. The Ice Truck Killer outmaneuvered Miami's finest without the insider advantage that Dexter relied upon. Brian Moser's ability to stay consistently ahead of police investigations demonstrated an intuitive understanding of law enforcement procedures that made him nearly impossible to catch, despite leaving his artwork all over the city. Brian's crime scene manipulation revealed his deep knowledge of police investigation techniques. He deliberately planted misleading evidence, like the incomplete leg cut on his pool victim that sent detectives hunting for a witness who never existed. He understood exactly what would trigger specific investigative responses and used that knowledge to direct police attention away from himself. His digital and physical footprint management was flawless. Despite conducting extensive research on his victims and brother, Brian left no traceable online activity. He maintained his Rudy Cooper identity for years without raising flags in any system. Even his refrigerated truck was acquired through channels that frustrated police's attempts to track it back to him. Brian's ability to predict police movements showed remarkable insight. He abandoned his refrigerated truck method immediately after it became a focus of the investigation, adapting his approach before law enforcement could establish meaningful patterns. When Neil Perry falsely confessed, Brian recognized the police would eventually discover the error and continued his work without missing a beat. Most impressively, Brian infiltrated the investigation itself through his relationship with Deborah, gaining real-time intelligence on police progress without leaving fingerprints on sensitive information. This allowed him to stay consistently ahead, while Dexter, despite working directly with the investigators, often had to scramble to cover his own tracks. I think Brian's evasion of law enforcement without insider access demonstrates superior skill compared to Dexter's reliance on his position within Miami Metro. Brian understood police psychology and procedure well enough to manipulate the entire department from the outside, turning their own methods against them. If he had Dexter's direct access to case information, he might have remained undetectable indefinitely. But perhaps Brian's most remarkable achievement was how he created a cohesive, artistic narrative through his killings. He beat the system, he beat the psychology, but he also had something else: meaning. The Ice Truck Killer elevated murders to high art, while Dexter's kills were made utilitarian disposal jobs. Brian Moser infused each crime scene with symbolic meaning and visual impact that transcended simple killing, creating a macabre portfolio that communicated on multiple levels simultaneously. Brian's crime scenes told a cohesive story across multiple tableaus. Each body placement referenced locations from Dexter's childhood, creating a narrative breadcrumb trail leading back to their shared trauma. The swimming pool, fountain, and ice hockey rink weren't random. They were chapters in a carefully constructed psychological journey designed to awaken Dexter's buried memories.
What kind of memories you having?
They're still a little vague.
Right. You're gonna have to face it eventually. Maybe next time.
The aesthetic composition of Brian's work demonstrated genuine artistic sensibility. His victims' body parts were arranged in lifelike poses, creating striking visual juxtapositions between the familiar and the horrific. The blood-drained limbs, carefully wrapped and positioned, showed an appreciation for a presentation that turned murder into performance art meant to be discovered and interpreted. Brian understood the psychological impact of his crime scenes on both the public and law enforcement. He deliberately played with expectations, sometimes creating spectacular displays, and other times leaving subtle, disturbing details that lingered in viewers' minds. This manipulation of emotional response shows sophistication well beyond Dexter's straightforward stab and rap approach. Most significantly, Brian's killing served a higher purpose, reconnecting with his brother. Each murder was a message, each tableau a signpost leading Dexter towards revelation. While Dexter killed to satisfy his dark passenger, Brian killed to communicate, to reveal truth, and ultimately to free his brother from what he saw as Harry's constraints. Brian's artistic approach to murder demonstrated intellectual and creative depths that Dexter's pragmatic killing never achieved. Brian was creating meaning through death, turning Miami into his canvas and murder into his medium. The fact that his work still haunted Deborah and others years later proves the lasting psychological impact he intended. When it comes to creating memorable, meaningful death, Brian was the expert. Every murder had a message, and nobody got the message more clearly than Dexter, because Brian saw Dexter's weakness right away. The Ice Truck Killer possessed an uncanny ability to read his brother's psychological weak points while remaining completely invisible to him. Brian Moser immediately identified Dexter's emotional vulnerabilities and exploited them masterfully, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of his brother that Dexter utterly failed to reciprocate. Brian recognized the significance of Deborah and Dexter's life long before engaging with either of them. He understood that despite Dexter's supposed emotional detachment, he maintained a genuine connection with his adopted sister, perhaps his only real human attachment. Brian identified this vulnerability and strategically positioned himself to exploit it through his relationship with Deborah.
I don't know. I just might have to fight you for this one.
Okay, we'll arm wrestle later.
His insight extended beyond obvious connections to more subtle psychological pressure points. Brian understood that Dexter harbored subconscious curiosity about his origins and methodically constructed scenarios that would trigger that curiosity. He intuitively grasped the psychological locks that Harry had placed on Dexter's memories and developed the perfect keys to open them. Most impressively, Brian accurately assessed Dexter's inner conflict between his authentic self and his constructed identity. He recognized that beneath Dexter's careful adherence to the code existed a desire for freedom and acceptance that Harry's rules never provided. This insight formed the foundation of his ultimate appeal to Dexter, the offer of unconditional brotherhood without pretense. Meanwhile, Dexter remained completely blind to Brian's existence and intentions until the game was nearly complete. Despite his supposed predatory instincts, Dexter never sensed that he was being watched, never recognized the peculiar focus of the Ice Truck Killer's messages, and never suspected Rudy despite multiple interactions. Brian operated in Dexter's blind spots with perfect precision. I think that Brian's ability to read and manipulate Dexter's psychological vulnerabilities while remaining completely undetected demonstrate a level of emotional intelligence that far surpasses his brother's. Brian understood Dexter better than Dexter understood himself, creating an asymmetrical awareness that gave Brian a decisive advantage in their complex relationship. And perhaps most tellingly, Brian's vision for their future together revealed a level of acceptance that Dexter couldn't match. Because at the end of the day, Brian wasn't pretending to be normal. He owned what he was, because Brian had superior self-acceptance. The Ice Truck Killer exhibited complete comfort in his own skin, while Dexter remained trapped in self-denial. Brian Moser had fully embraced his true nature without shame or hesitation, achieving a psychological wholeness that his conflicted brother could never attain while clinging to Harry's artificial construct. Brian didn't waste any energy pretending to be something he wasn't. He fully acknowledged and accepted his darkness, integrating it completely into his identity rather than compartmentalizing it as a passenger separate from himself. This self-acceptance gave him the psychological clarity and internal consistency that Dexter, constantly at war with himself, could never achieve. The emotional freedom that came with Brian's self-acceptance was evident in his demeanor. He displayed genuine joy in his work, taking pleasure in his crimes without the burden of guilt or self-loathing that frequently haunted Dexter. Even in his final moments, Brian remained true to himself, never apologizing for who he was or what he had done. Brian's acceptance extended to his brother as well. He offered Dexter someone no one else ever had, complete understanding and unconditional acceptance of his true self. While Harry had taught Dexter to channel his urges, Brian wanted to celebrate them. This vision of brotherhood without masks represented a profound psychological liberation that momentarily tempted even Dexter. This complete self-integration gave Brian significant psychological advantages in high-pressure situations. He didn't experience the internal conflicts that occasionally paralyzed Dexter, nor did he suffer from the identity crisis that periodically disrupted his brother's carefully maintained facade. Brian knew exactly who he was and embraced it fully. Brian's total of self-acceptance represents the road not taken for Dexter, a path of psychological integration rather than fragmentation. The tragedy of their relationship is that Brian offered Dexter the chance to be wholly himself without pretense, but Dexter had become too invested in his constructed identity to embrace that freedom. Brian lived authentically until the end, while Dexter remained divided against himself, a fractured killer pretending to be whole.
You should know this isn't easy for me. I've done more to deserve my knife than anyone. You're the only one I ever wanted to set free.
So yeah, Dexter might have survived, but only because Brian let him. Make sure you're subscribed because next up, I got Dexter versus Walter White, and you don't want to miss that one.